with a bit of delay because of some technical issues that don't hurt you because you actually made it in person, but for the remote people, it's a bit annoying because our camera doesn't work. Welcome to this year's edition of Security Times of Surveillance. I will do a little bit of housekeeping. We sadly have had Camilla cancelling because she lost her voice. So she cannot make it, not even remote. This means we have a bit less of a tight schedule today, but we will just start the call a bit earlier. We have 2 coffee breaks and the lunch break that will all happen outside on this side. So if we have any people that still did not quit smoking, then that way off the campus, like there's a bridge over the double, and then there you can smoke. And I think this is pretty much it from our side. We're very happy that still so many people made it given the temperatures.
So I just want to say, I also like you to welcome you to the morning session. We start off with Chloé Berthélémy, which is the concept of encryption rights. And I have to go some of the regular this way. And she will speak about something that is very, very central to this movement. She will speak about the development in the EU to expand on lawful interception and restricting cryptography policies.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the warm welcome and for the second invitation. This presentation kind of resembles a little bit the one I did last year, but with some updates because it's been a year time and the EU hasn't been sleeping on the topic of encryption. And so my goal today is to provide you with some updates about what's going on, what is being discussed in the political spheres in Brussels. A little bit about myself, as Sven mentioned, I'm Chloé. I work at European Digital Rights. It's a network organization. We represent more than 50 NGOs currently across all Europe. And all those NGOs are working together to defend and promote digital rights. We do so by advocating towards EU institutions in Brussels for better legislation, or we try. Sometimes we have some success, sometimes not. But basically, this is our mission and our goal. Yes. Here's something a little bit about today's presentation structure. I will bring you some context first, a little bit of history as well. I really like it to put things into perspective. Try to present to you what has been done in the European mandate 2024-2029 so far. We're 3 years approximately in. What has the European Union worked on this topic? A little bit of information about that. And then more specifically, I'm going to dive into the current process that is ongoing, which is the expert group that was formed by the European Commission. That is supposed to produce a technology roadmap by the end of the year / beginning of next year. And I'm going to try to give you some snippet about what they did in their first meetings, because this is really important for the future. The work of this expert group will probably inform future action by the European Commission, by the European Union, either legislative or non-legislative. But I will come to that in a moment. If you're lost, don't worry. The context. There is increasing pressure on the European Union level to act on encryption, to do something about encryption, because at the national level, there are a lot of developments as well. So for example, in Sweden and in France, we had attempts in legislation to find solutions to access encrypted data for law enforcement authorities. So to increase the potential of investigative competent authorities to circumvent encryption and other security, digital security features in order to access data. They really passed legislation trying to force service providers to weaken their digital systems or to legalize hacking by intelligence services or law enforcement authorities. But it can be also like a little bit more soft power, let's say, not necessarily legislation, like the Danish justice minister going to the press and saying, we need to ban encryption in the EU. They're very radical, it's one of the most extreme. But those are kind of the positions that you can see in European debates. This is taking place in the context of the post-Snowden era. Then kind of, I don't know how many crypto wars we had. It depends how many you count. But it really much is inherited from this period where the European Union is trying to figure out its position on encryption. On the one side, they say it's essential for the economy, for the protection of personal data, or fundamental rights. They do accept it to some extent, but also they picture it, they describe it as a major threat to the detection, investigation, and prosecution of crimes. There is always this kind of tension, and it's going on for so many years. We're going to see in a minute, but this is where the EU is standing, and it's captured in a Council resolution. Council is the representatives of the member states, currently 27. In a 2020 position, and they call it security for encryption, security despite encryption. And I really kind of encapsulate the tension they're facing, or they think they're facing, honestly. A little bit of history, why we came to this point, because I think it's nice to go back. The original story starts in the US in the 90s, where we had the first development of some digital security protection and encryption, like PGP. You know it better than I do, probably. But my point is to say, with the emergence of those security and privacy protections, governments started to think we need to react to it because we're losing access to data. For the purpose of law enforcement. And so the Clipper chip, which you can see on the left, was kind of this chipset that was developed and promoted by the NSA, the US NSA, and that was kind of the built-in backdoor that allowed governments to decode intercepted voice and data transmissions. They operated on a simple key escrow technology. And it took just 1 year for apparently a major flaw to be detected in the system. So this didn't really live long and faced a lot of resistance and criticism from the technology sector and also civil liberties activists. Why I'm bringing the US context is because it had a lot of impact on the law enforcement communities here in Europe. Although it's a US-driven stuff at the time, and the EU didn't really have a lot of competence in security at the time. They weren't able to take legislation in the security field. It really impacted the spirit and the minds of law enforcement, and this episode is really ingrained in how we debate today in the European Union. Fast forward to 2010s. The Snowden revelation prompted some widespread public reckoning with digital privacy. There was a spike in consumer demand for secure communications, services and devices. And therefore, the offer grew. We had more and more new communication service providers emerging, proposing private communications. Some of them directly encrypted from the start end to end. Some took some years to implement end-to-end encryption. But the result is there that end-to-end encryption became more accessible to a wider set of persons, to almost the mainstream. And nowadays everybody is relying on one of those, right? What does it mean for law enforcement? They freaked out. And basically it really shapes this mainstream accessibility to end-to-end encryption is really driving the debate in law enforcement about this. In 2011, so at the peak of all the emergence of all those new services, this lady, Chloé, who was the general counsel of the FBI, testified in front of the US Senate Judiciary Committee and described the situation as law enforcement going dark. Law enforcement going dark means they cannot see anymore, they're going blind, because they no longer have access to the data they used to. Now it's protected by end-to-end encryption. This going dark problem was kind of crystallized, exemplified by the FBI affair in the San Bernardino case. If you don't know that case, the FBI found an iPhone belonging to one of the perpetrators of the San Bernardino massacre, mass shooting, in 2015, and they tried to compel Apple to decrypt the device, and Apple refused. And that led to a lot of drama, both in the press, but also legally, because the FBI started to launch a formal complaint against Apple that brought Apple to court in order to force them to help the FBI unlock the phone. Now, the case was dropped from the FBI because they found an alternative solution relying on some, I think, Australian or New Zealand, I don't remember, company that managed to hack the Apple phone. But that really sealed the kind of going dark framing, and you can see very clearly the going dark framing being reused by intelligence service communities, representatives. This is a statement by the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes are Australia, Canada, the US, New Zealand, and the UK. And this is a community of intelligence service that exchange data, strategies, and so on. And this is a statement from 2020, where they complained about end-to-end encryption preventing them from doing their job and calling for the legislators to put in place some measures in the law to force service providers to give them access to the data, even though it's encrypted. What happened in the EU? Usually the encryption debate in the EU was driven by terrorism, the threat of terrorism in the framing. That's because we had big terrorist attacks that really shocked a lot of people in the 2000s, Madrid and London. But then we also had Paris and Brussels and so on in 2015. And that was really driving the demand, we need access to terrorist communication in order to report terrorist threats. But actually, the debate shift, the pretext to undermine encryption shift, after Facebook announced in 2019 that they would roll out end-to-end encryption on all their messaging services. And if you know the story, this sparked a lot of reactions among governments and almost a panic attack, because a lot of child sexual abuse material is being distributed or actually distributed. It's being detected on Facebook messaging services on the US side and then transmitted to the EU. And the EU realized that with the rollout of end-to-end encryption on Facebook services, they would lose a lot of that information, a lot of reports about CSAM being spread. What they thought was having a legal solution, and that you know of, I'm pretty sure, if you know with the latest year's development. The Commission proposed a legislation called the Child Sexual Abuse Regulation, also known as child control. And that is a legislative proposal still currently being negotiated and discussed, but that would force all communication service provider to scan all the content on their private communication service in order to detect CSAM and to report it to the police. Yes. I put some snippet, like press reports from the chat control. As you may know, the EU started with this very strong intrusive proposal, and there's some back and forth, and there's been a lot of like civil society mobilization, citizens mobilization against this proposal for mass surveillance or private communications. And actually, it was successful in the sense that the EU started to kind of back away from the original idea. And now it's going, like the devil is in the details, so we need to be very specific about what the proposal currently contains. But at least the original idea, which was mandatory scanning of all private communication, regardless if it's encrypted or not, for everybody, covering anybody, is kind of out of the picture. So it was kind of positive that we managed to achieve a change of proposal thanks to mobilization. And talking about that, I want to provide you some really hottest, latest update, because that dates from like yesterday or the day before. But first, the interim e-privacy directive. I want to say a few words. If you don't know, currently the big tech companies that are running messenger services, WhatsApp, even Apple, Google, if you like, they are able, and specifically Meta, they are able to voluntarily scan private communications. This is not a given, because in EU law, you have a principle since 2002 and the e-privacy directive that private communications are private. So you shouldn't have scanning by any companies. But then this provisional derogation allows companies to do it anyway. Doesn't catch. It's supposed to be a temporary solution. It's supposed to be a temporary derogation from the general rule that private communications are private. But unfortunately, this derogation has been extended until April 2026. There was a need to re-extend again the possibility for companies to voluntarily scan private communication. And this time, because of the success of our reframing on chat control, the European Parliament wanted to reduce a little bit the scope of their derogation, not rubber stamp it like the other times, but maybe make it like less intrusive, still intrusive, but less intrusive, let's say. And so they, with I'm not going to go into detail, but with like a turn of events, they rejected the proposal to extend it. So in theory, currently, in EU law, you cannot voluntarily scan the private messages of your users. Theoretically, Facebook should have stopped, I don't know, but they do. Probably they still do, but that's another topic. But in theory, they no longer have this derogation. So they shouldn't be able to voluntarily scan your private communication if you're using those services. Now, the European Parliament said no, but the Council said, yes, we want this, yes, we need that. So they're kind of pushing it onto the Parliament to revote their position in a massive undemocratic turn of events. Like, no, we don't want this. And like, yes, you do. So we'll see in the coming weeks how this goes, but basically the battle is not over. So I talked to you about the voluntary interim solution and voluntary scanning, but let's talk a little bit about the chat control proposal, which I just mentioned before, which is this time a permanent solution and also includes mandatory detection. You can see the difference between the two legislation. There's still a lot to be decided, to be honest. The Parliament and the Council are in negotiations in what we call trilogues with the Commission. So they try to find a common position among the three of them. A lot is undecided. The scope of content, is it just images, text? Is it also voices, message bit? Is it grooming? Is it, we don't know. The type of communication, we don't know. Age verification is also part of the chat control proposal. Is there going to be a mandatory a legal obligation on all service providers to age verify their users and prevent some underage user or to a certain limit, I don't know, 16 years old, to access their service or not? It's still undecided if it's going to be mandatory or voluntary. Targeted versus mass is detection order, so we want to detect CSAM. Is it going to be against certain specific type of person that we are suspecting of spreading CSAM or using CSAM? Or is it going to be mass? Everybody's in the same boat. They're supposed to try to find a compromise next Monday. But there's a lot to be undecided, so I'm not so sure they're going to manage, but you never know in Brussels. Sometimes there is this practice, which is not fun, where they lock themselves in a room until they figure something out. And that can last until 4 a.m., 5 a.m. And so on. So it depends how strong the presidency of the council, which this time is Cyprus, want to get a deal and want to have a final decided text. To be seen. One note, encryption is a priori protected. It's basically end-to-end encrypted services are in the scope of this regulation, but there is a provision that says any measure you put in place to prevent the spread of CSAM on your service should undermine encryption. I think it's up to the trust you have in your service provider. I want to talk a little bit about something else that was less known. I think I mentioned it also last year, but again, I want to drill on this point. We talk a lot about the mainstreaming and multiplication of popular encrypted messaging application, but there were also in the 2010 the emergence of also like other service providers providing encrypted messaging. They're less known, but they have become, in the past years, the target of cross-border police operation, which implied the mass hacking of their services. So basically, police in several countries got together and figured out their targets, and through some complicated judicial maneuvers, managed to, and technical maneuvers as well, target entire communication systems and collect the data of all their users. The most famous one are InfoChat and Selective. But more recently, you had also Ghost or Matrix, which were also services targeted. Mass hacking is obviously very concerning because it's a general and indiscriminated interception of everyone's communication and service without individualized suspicion. You don't need to say this person is suspected of a specific crime. Everybody's data is being accessed. And those police cooperation operations are very important to understand the law enforcement strategy behind it. They are presented as police success stories, but they also are used to justify that this is not enough. They want more. Police hacking operation cost a lot of money, a lot of resources to cooperate and figure out how to do it. And therefore, what they say is that it's too much relying on a factor of chance. This time they managed to hack it. This time they managed to hack it, but this is exceptional. And so it helps them kind of demand a legal solution for mandated backdoors. Like we can no longer rely on just chance and having those operations where we manage to hack a system. We want a permanent solution where every time we need access to the data, the technical solution is there. It also helps them delegitimizing encryption per se, because those networks, which were massively used by organized crime, that's true, they managed to make a connection between encryption and criminality. And so you have a presumption of suspicion being created through this collusion of the two. And then it's really much pushing for, as I said, the principle, the idea that it shouldn't rely on chance, it shouldn't be a matter of luck to get access to the data, but every communication and data should be, by default, accessible to law enforcement for the purpose of their investigation. This is an example. Opinion in famous media in Brussels by the head of Europol. Europol is the law enforcement cooperation agency of the European Union, and the executive director, Catherine de Bolle, published this op-ed with the district attorney from New York, Cyrus Vance, and in there, in this op-ed, they really push the narrative that encryption is used by criminals, and we need a solution. This is another example. So they just published a lot of reports. It's just to exemplify a little bit that this is a constant narrative battle, and that every time we say, no, encryption is actually super useful, it's a vital, essential element of democracy, of fundamental rights, of economy, blah, blah, blah. They always publish like very fancy reports to say, like, we have a problem, we need a solution. So joint declaration by the European police chiefs. So all the chiefs of the police in member states met in 2024. They published a joint declaration saying encryption is a threat to our web. Europol published another report. Europol has a thing with encryption. What happened in the mandate 2024, 2029? So we're in the first years. First, the European Commission and the Swedish presidency of the Council, so Sweden, in short, created a high-level group called Access to Data for Encrypted Law Enforcement. I call it Going Dark, because that's their mission, what I explained before. This working group was composed mainly of law enforcement officers and representatives and prosecutors. There was really a club of police. And they figured out, they thought of recommendations they could put forward to the EU on the matter of access to data. And so that covered a lot of things, but encryption was obviously part of it. It was a very opaque process, very difficult to get access to information of what was discussed. But what we know is that the concerns or perspective of data protection and fundamental rights were very considered. What did they put forward as a recommendation? They put 42. We're not going to go through all of them, of course, but the main ones are encryption backdoors. So they push for this obligation of having vulnerabilities in systems in order to be exploited, or at least like in a legal access, despite encryption, that they call lawful access by design. Again, this is this idea of like, we no longer want to be relying on luck. We want to have access if we demand it. An obligation on service provider to decrypt if they encrypt. Same thing. Obligation to collect and retain data. If you don't collect data, like signal that, for example, there may be a chance that they put in law an obligation to start collecting more data about your users, just for the purpose of being accessible to law enforcement. Real-time interception, they also have proposed some sort of rules, because we don't have them at the level currently. Harsh sanctions if you don't comply, fines, market ban, individual liability, and then the scope. Before was really much restricted because the 90s and the 2000s make it like this. It was really much focused on telecom providers, obviously. And now that they figured out that all the communications have moved to those new services, those OTTs, or the cloud services, they want to include everybody. They want to include all of them in those legal obligations. What happened next? So the high-level group Going Dark is releasing their recommendation. The Commission is like, thank you, police. We're going to release a net-announced security strategy called Protect EU, which was released last year in 2025. And this is what the Commission kind of draw as a to-do list from the high-level group Going Dark recommendations. And you can see that the most interesting piece for us today is the technology roadmap on encryption, so the third bullet point. to identify and assess technological solutions to enable lawful access to data by law enforcement authorities in 2026. It's not going to happen in 2026, probably next year. But this is what we're going to focus on. So we're at it again with the crypto wars. Whoa, let me see. Sorry, that's my bad. So they set up this extra group for technology roadmap. This is the webpage. You can have a look. It's public. One good thing about this process, contrary to the high-level group that I just mentioned before, the one just made up of police, that was completely opaque and there was no access to information. This one has a website, like a web page, sorry, on the Commission's website. And you can access all the terms of reference, you can access the members, the list of people who are sitting in there. There are 12. They've been recruited by the Commission. And you can even access information at the meetings, like minutes and agenda, if you want. But for the sake, because I'm a nice person, I summarize everything. If you look at the terms of reference, so what is the mission of this group is to focus first on fixed and mobile communication device, particularly in the context of digital forensics, so getting access to data in the context of an investigation, and data retention. The group should identify potential technical options and assess their suitability to improve lawful access to data by law enforcement. And they need to consider existing solutions as well as future potential ones. And lastly, they should examine the risks that this technology poses, and then as well try to address, mitigate, and possibly remedy such risks. So what are the risks of those technical solutions, and how do we remedy them? So the group met 3 times. They seem to meet every 2 months. And they discuss. What did they discuss? First, the first thing that they did in the 2 first meetings, I think they're still discussing this, but they're close to an end, is the criteria for assessment of possible solutions. So they basically draw a list of criteria to evaluate the technical solutions they're going to evaluate and assess. So what kind of criteria they're looking at for looking at technical solutions to access encrypted data? Feasibility and operational efficacy. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see some of them. It's like, can it be easily circumvented by the target? Can the solution be easily detected by the target? Or can it remain secret? Is the user notified? How much does it cost? Can it allow easily cross-border requests? If one authority needs the data from a service provider in another jurisdiction, is this technological solution easily transferable? Or the second one is cybersecurity and robustness. You can see, is that this increase the attack surface? Can it be misused by someone else? Impact on protocol standards. What do I know? Well, basically. 3 other criteria. Is the solution allowing a targeted approach, or is it necessarily undermining the security of all users, or it's like mass interference? Transparency and auditability. Is the legal solution enabling some transparent logging, reporting of what the solution, the measure does to the device? That has to do with evidence admissibility in courts, basically. And lastly, necessity, preventing abuse, proportionality. Is the solution enabling us to put some safeguards that it's not being misused? Yeah, basically that. Can it respect the warrant that a judge is giving the police, for example. And so they started also mapping solutions. So we had the criteria. Now they're looking at what solution exists or could exist. This is again a summary of a very brief, very succinct minutes. So we don't know the full-fledged discussion that they have. But basically they're looking at data at rest in law enforcement possession. So that's for all size device by law enforcement. They're trying to look at manufacturer cooperation, like how much do you need the service provider to cooperate with law enforcement to give access to the device stored, to the data stored on the device size. And they're also looking at the cloud-based key escrow systems. Real-time communication as well. So when data is in transit, I think they put aside client-side scanning, which is funny because it was presented originally client-side scanning as the solution to not undermine encryption, and now with like all the toxicity this measure gain is out of. Apparently, the experts are saying like we don't want to access it. But they're looking at key escrow. They're looking at basically all interception. Hacking measures. Some of the things are beyond my technical knowledge, to be honest. Lastly, they look at targeted remote access techniques, so spyware, basically, when the person doesn't know. So covering techniques. They're looking at the ghost proposal, if you know about it. It's the silent adding to a group chat of a third party. That's an example. Wow. So it's only three meetings so far. So I wouldn't imagine that they've come up with a fully fledged report at the end of the year. So what I suspect is that the final outcome will be in the first half of 2027. Depends how fast they work. I haven't seen the minutes for the April meeting, to be honest. I don't know how far they went, but probably not far enough. And then I don't know what they discussed in June either. So again, I'm trying to look for more information, but this is something to look out for in the coming month, and this is something that we as a jury will monitor. Is there any questions?
Well, thank you very much for this great talk and making accessible what's happening behind the scenes and in this whole context. Any questions, please?
Well, the technical focus is on communication apps. From the technical perspective, there's not a difference between communication and any kind of sharing data. But with the supplying to, are you actually worried about supplying to, say, uploading an encrypted file to a server and getting someone else access to that server, or like causing someone to use an encrypted file, or like writing code on a postcard? Like, where's the line of the technology doesn't really line on this, or sort of legal or social line. You got
The scope of services, you mean?
I guess so, yeah.
And they are quite wide-ranging. They're not limiting themselves to private communications service providers, so messengers. They really look out also at cloud providers, for sure. And almost all hosting service provider. Everything that hosts content for a user, for a customer, is basically in scope. They really are wide in their approach, but they do focus specifically on end-to-end encrypted services. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah.
There's maybe a little bit of an odd question, related, I think. Some voices you will say it might be also considerable constructive theory that all these exchanges are all preliminary for preparing a system for control control the world and all the individuals in ways of like for carbon dioxide budgeted systems implementation in the future, like for example those measures to be able to control and order the law enforcement control instead of only preventing those terrorisms and child sexual abuse, those all other reasons. How do you consider that this might not be very realistic, but there are voices that say, well, it's probably driven by my power in the world that the measures and solutions that they're talking about, requesting those criteria are promoted and affiliated by certain influences on high level, like the KCs. Is that a risk that you should consider?
I think for me the situation is serious enough without having to go conspiracy theory, to be honest. This drive for encryption backdoors, call it whatever you want. They call it lawful access to data. I call it encryption backdoor. This is driven by the most powerful governments on the planet. So that's enough, I think, for me to be serious. Like the US, obviously. Most member states in the EU, Australia, and so on. More and more, as I told you at the beginning, in the context, they're like passing laws in order to enforce those obligations on service providers. Now, what to your point about, is it just for catching terrorists and organized crime? It's never the case, isn't it? Because you know how malleable, changeable those definitions are, and how the etiquette of a terrorist is being like very arbitrarily allocated to different communities, to different individuals, etc. So the risk is there, and I think obviously we always point out as digital rights activists to the slippery slope of introducing one measure to tackle a very serious social issue. Terrorism is a social issue. Child sexual abuse is a social issue. The problem is that the answer that governments are proposing go way beyond the challenges that those social issues raise and are really implementing mass surveillance measures, targeting everybody. And that's the problem we have with those. Next question.
So I guess law enforcement agencies claim that they need chat control. I was wondering if there are also independent scientific studies on potential benefits of chat control, or it's basically just claiming something.
Answers no. All the studies that were released on chat control, this is not my area of expertise. I want to put this disclaimer, but to my knowledge, all the studies that are praising the benefit of client-side scanning or also have some way a conflict of interest because they're produced by or paid for by commercial actors who have an interest in selling that technology and would gain a lot of profit from it. So Microsoft, for example, is one behind a lot of studies that praise client-side scanning as a tool. But what we saw in the chat control legislative proposal and process, I think there was over 500 signatures of independent researchers all across Europe who signed a letter saying this is not possible, this is a dangerous proposal and technological solution. And then you had one landmark article written by several cryptographic experts called Bugs in Our Pocket. I'm happy also to circulate it. I think it's very well known in the community now, but like really unpacking what client-side scanning is in a very rigorous manner compared to what we have on the website. The answer is no.
Any other questions? That's the last question.
There's a last question now. I'm sorry. Come to me after.
I don't know who's first.
Thank you for the great talk. The thing I didn't see when you were talking about encryption was if during the discussions around that they speak about fundamental rights. So, for example, I was an expert witness in a defense case for encryption, and what we found was that the French military intelligence was used to compromise the servers. And then the evidence from the military was passed into civilian courts across borders where the defendants didn't have a fundamental right to confront their accuser with regard to the actual raw evidence or the methods used to collect it, where normally the military is not allowed to do that. France is a special case. But I wonder, is that ever a part of the discussion such that the criminal defendant in these cases will actually understand the methods and means and the raw evidence rather than synthesized evidence? Where Europol, for example, promises this is really a picture they took from the phone, but they won't actually tell you how to run it, what the exploit was, or any of these vulnerabilities. And this is less a technical question, more about do we still have those rights in the future question. Thank you again for your talk.
Thank you. Maybe we take the other question, or do you want? So I don't know the question, or
I think you can do.
we have time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I can okay. Yes. Is fundamental rights? No, no, not enough. At least to make this. This is a huge issue. I mean, everything you said obviously is huge legal challenges that are being debated by lawyers that are active in those cases, experts like yourself. We bring to the front this massive issue of, I mentioned this judicial maneuver, this judicial architecture that they constructed around the two case, encryption and SkyCC, which is very complex and is relying both on national law, but also European and international cooperation law. And so they used a combination of those different legal tools in order to make the interception and the mass hacking operation legal. What we describe is that it's a forum shopping tactic, which means we pick among the countries that are part of the operation, the one that has the least protection in their national law. In this case, France is a very good candidate and actually carried out the two hacks. And they basically managed to get an order from the judge. They collected all the data in bulk and then started distributing all the data collected to the relevant jurisdictions, so the partner countries, depending on how relevant was the data to their case. So all the German users data were going to Germany, Sweden, Norway, UK, and so on and so forth. And the problem that you describe is that suspects are being brought to court and they cannot actually request the authentication and the verification of the evidence that is brought against them because French law. In French law is providing you from looking at this because they impose defense secrecy on this evidence. You cannot question how the evidence was collected, you cannot question how the evidence was preserved and make sure that they are authentic and have not been tampered with. And this is very grave because it undermines fundamentally the right to a fair trial and the presumption of innocence. And that is done through a very complex combination of national law and international cooperation instrument that allows the exchange of data. It's not debated enough.
Okay, so it's a quick question.
That was a big question. I tried to be focused.
Thank you for the call again. I have one question, it's quite small. Has it any relation towards the secrecy, the old-fashioned mails, the envelope? In the Netherlands, if I send something here, they're not allowed to open my envelope and I close it. It's the same secrecy, right? You send something, here it cannot, but in the not allowed to open them. How is that by law, in relation to this legislation? Because I would also send certain materials in this thing.
So I think actually there is a possibility to intercept mail if you have a warrant by a judge. So your right to privacy is not absolute. This is how the society we live in, and so there are limitations that can be put to this, the exercise of your right to privacy, in case of legitimate interest, public interest. And so the law is here to circumscribe the limitation of this interference with your right to privacy. It has to match certain conditions, it has to have several safeguards. For example, we are not going to open the mail of everybody, just for the sake of maybe looking for someone who's sending something wrong. And that's the issue. That's the issue. Like digitalization enables them to have mass surveillance measures, which are much more complicated to apply offline. But what's funny with your question is that it kind of points out to the irony of their argument, because their argument is to say we have this possibility offline, so we want to have the same possibility online.
Why don't you do it offline if you find it so important?
Sorry.
Why don't you do it offline as well? That's the irony. Exactly.
I don't have an answer for you. You will have to ask the question directly.
Something I want to put out here. Maybe do your work and 100%, not only focus on this.
I agree with you. I agree with you. Offline, you force, because of the cost and the resources it requires, you force a targeted approach, something that they are not keen to do online, and this is something that should be pointed as a hypocrisy, in my opinion. Thank you for your attention.
Is so Matthias will be this is a very nice overview and analysis of the process.
I agree.
Like a small?
You think you should work here.
Or
Just stay there.
very beautiful. I should stay there. Close to the camera?
Preferably, yes, because otherwise the online people can't see you.
Uh-huh.
You have your desktop camera.
Ah, I see. Okay. Cool. I'm good. Or,
Yeah, I think this was already good.
Okay, thank you for that kind of yeah, so welcome everyone. As most of you already know, cryptography underpins, at least technically, the security of our data and communications by providing the methods and algorithms to provide the protection in untrusted settings. However, for this to actually work, these methods and algorithms should actually provide the security that we want them to provide. And we should build confidence in that before we actually, deploy these methods. And this is quite difficult because there's many moving parts to cryptography, and the sort of confidence we build in its security, and relies on a long chain of reasoning and a long and complex chain of reasoning. And so this brings me sort of to the main underlying idea or message of this talk. And this topic is that machine check reasoning can help increase the confidence across the cryptographic spectrum. Okay. And so the second level when I'm talking about can be seen as follows. So when we design cryptography on the very low level, basic level, we have our hard assumptions, which are the mathematical problems that we deem to be hard or feasible to solve with our computer. And so then we use these hard assumptions to design our primitives and schemes which are essentially cryptographic building blocks. So these are one or several algorithms that are meant to specific cryptographic tasks. And then in turn, we use these primitives and schemes to build or design our protocols, which are essentially the message sequences or interactions between parties to establish or start communicating in a secure manner with a definition of security that depends on the context. So but then eventually we have to actually implement this design and these schemes and protocols to actually run it, of course. And yeah, so this is essentially the spectrum that I'm considering now on a high level. This is of course abstracting away quite a bit, but this is what I will be considering. And then across this spectrum and different parts, we have different techniques and approaches to sort of gain confidence in that what we are doing is actually correct, and this provides security that we want. So, for example, as we're starting at the lowest level of design here, and that would be hardness assumptions. We have cryptanalysis, which essentially just tries to, it tries to find the best attack against the mathematical problems or best solutions, and then justify thereby that these are actually sufficiently hard to solve to build up a corresponding. Then for the design of the primitive schemes and the protocols, we have mathematical proofs essentially, showing that they provide the security that we want them to provide. So we sort of specify the protocols and primitives in a mathematical or algorithmic way, and then provide the proof. And for the implementation part, then there's you can sort of look at it in two sort of separate parts, where the realization of the specification by the implementation is mostly done through testing of input-output behavior, whether the inputs are validated properly, and this kind of testing analysis. And then on the implementation level itself, there's still the question of whether the implementations don't exhibit observable behavior inside their execution environment, essentially, which could lead secrets during execution that are not typically abstracted away or not accounted for on the specification level. Right, so despite all these methods and approaches that we have in trying to establish confidence, there are still things that can and do go wrong at all levels. And so, for example, for the proofs that we have on the specification level, or the protocols and primitives, well, the proof could be wrong in itself, or alternatively, the proof maybe not exactly apply to what we had, to the actual thing that we end up deploying, or it did apply once, but then the actual thing developed and the proof doesn't apply anymore. And so there are several or numerous examples of these are similar things, but these are just some relatively recent ones. And some of them, sometimes, like a proof can be wrong, and it's really just like a proof issue. So this would be the case for Things Plus, for example, Copyright and WireGuard, where eventually you can simply fix the proof so that there's no real world attack or problem. Well, in other cases, which is the case for the other two, there's actually also then, well, the proof was thought to be correct for a very long time, then it turned out to not be correct, and extra attacks, corresponding attacks in the real world, secret extraction was possible. So then on the implementation side of things, on the technical side, when we try to see whether the implementation properly realizes the specification, we typically do this, as I said, by sort of testing and analysis, but typically, like, you cannot test, this is incomplete, because you cannot test all input-output behavior because there's too much. And so this can lead to, well, not testing for certain behaviors that might be bugs or problematic in the end. And so these are two examples here that are relatively recent, where in the first one there was no proper input validation on the implementation level, leading to again extraction of secrets. And in the second one, not really a concrete attacks that were possible, but still the implementation misbehaved for certain inputs that were not in the testing set. And so then finally for the side channels, well, this is also similarly typically sort of incomplete testing, which cannot test for all sort of possible environments that will be executed in. And this can lead to then, for example, here these two examples, side channels, leaks of secrets to binary differences when using the secret as an input to your operations. Observing binary differences then can lead to secret extraction. So, as these examples sort of show, things, despite having these methods and approaches to gain confidence, things can and do still go wrong. Because cryptography has many, again, many parts, and it is quite complex to, well, even on an individual part already do this properly, but also then combining the whole thing is complex and rather error-prone, especially because, for example, for the proofs, this is typically handwritten and a manual process. And for the testing, also got often referred to pen and paper methods. And the testing, as I said, is often incomplete and cannot cover all cases. And so this makes the whole process error-prone and giving a higher likelihood of failures. And so in recent years, tools and frameworks have been developed for use on a computer that allow to use the computer to actually verify the reasoning that we do, and for the post and also for the testing place sort of testing, also by reasoning about the implementation, sort of mathematically proving that it satisfies a certain specification for all inputs. Right, and it is also done by computer-aided cryptography sometimes. So back to the background that I quickly sketched in the beginning, and let's look at a specific, sort of specific parts now, and where machine technique or how it can be used and where it is used. So for protocols. So let's start with the protocols and their design. So a protocol, like very generically, typically looks as follows, where we have two communicating parties that communicate by sending each other messages that are at least in part computed from the cryptographic primitives that the protocol employs. And so then the aim of this is achieving a certain security guarantee that depends on the context, of course, and this assumes it is then assuming the certain appropriate properties of the primitive. And in a typical proof, we actually, or scenario model, we actually consider the adversary to be sort of at control over the whole network, so it can view all messages, see all messages, inject messages, alter messages. And so the question is whether the message sequence like this and actually provides the required security guarantees. And so also typically for protocols we are interested in a setting where there's like multiple simultaneous or composed sessions, because this matches what typically what we have in the real world, where there's many people using the protocol simultaneously. And also potentially with some of the parties in certain instances of the protocol. And so then understand like security guarantees really depend on the context, but to give you a quick example, quick ideas. So we have the fundamental ones, of course, that are like the confidentiality in our application, but most people will know confidentiality referring to only the right honest parties can see collected data, and authentication that the honest parties know who the document. And some more sort of advanced or specific protocol-specific properties are these more temporal properties in forward secrecy and post-compromise security, where it is about either past communication remaining secure after compromise, or the security sort of healing or recovering after compromise. And then we also have more privacy or surveillance-related properties that you can consider in, for example, anonymity and deniability, which is about, in the case of anonymity, the infeasibility sort of identifying communicating partners from outside, and deniability of not being able to prove, or well, the transcript, even if someone participated in a communication or protocol, then the transcript does not provide actual proof to a third party that this is that they participated. Okay, so for then the actual proofs that we do, and particularly machine check proofs, there is two different models that we consider. And these models, the main difference between them is essentially the granularity of the attacker and the primitives that goes hand in hand that are modeled, and so consequently the guarantees and the scale that we can prove models at is different as well. And so specifically, sort of how you can look at it is that in the symbolic model, we model the adversary by explicitly specifying the allowed behavior and computation that we can do, while in computational model we explicitly deny behavior, so we allow everything, but then deny a specific unreasonable or we deem unreasonable computations. And so similarly, or relatedly, I should say, the primitives in the symbolic model are less precise, more idealized, more like black box operations that, so they are just not as, but they don't specify the complete computation that actually happens in real life. While in the computational model, this is more, exactly as it is, as it would be more accurate to the actual computation that is being performed. And so from this, the rest sort of follows the guarantees in the symbolic model are weaker, because exactly because the adversary is allowed to do sort of less, and the adversary is weaker. And the opposite in the computational model. But then for scale, on the other hand, we are able to, prove larger sort of properties and models that we are interested in the computational or in the full protocols. As I showed with the many sessions and color parties, and this is very large scale essentially. But the symbolic model then allows for a lot of automation and thereby you're able to scale. While in the computation model, this is exactly because of the fact that it's more precise and not possible, not as easy. And so there's many tools on both ends, but the most sort of prevalent at the moment in the symbolic model are Telegram and Chloé, and the computational model Cryptography. And these have then also been used in quite some high-profile sort of case studies, which for Telegram, for example, has been used throughout at least part of the design and drafting phase for TLS 1.3, and actually also sort of in this process discovered throughout the class mistakes or errors or attacks that were discovered by hand, and thereby sort of informed updates to the overall protocol, and we can be sort of increase the confidence in the actual design. Similarly, for another example here, the other proof is for signal post-quantum digital exchange that it does at the beginning when establishing a communication channel. And this was actually after the design phase or drafting phase. This was sort of formally analyzed in both Chloé and Cryptography. And also here, as with sort of TLS, they discovered certain properties that were assumed were still needed on the primitives, as well as certain attacks in the protocol sort of sequencing that were not discovered by hand or before. Right. So then, that's the sort of short overview for protocols and tools. So now I will consider the primitives and implementations simultaneously, because I will also sort of cover the bridge between these two sort of layers, where for the realization of the primitive. So if we now look at this, this is a specific part here of the spectrum, then what we are interested in here on the primitive level itself, or the scheme level, is whether it's correct as shape. Where correct is a relatively basic property usually, you just like computes the right thing in an almost environment. But security obviously, like again, depends on the actual primitive scheme and context. And so two basic examples, of course, are encryption and signatures, where for encryption you want something along the lines of it being infeasible to extract information from the thing that is encrypted, and for signatures that no one can impersonate you or like another party or send messages on behalf of them. And for the actual, so the bridge between implementation and specification here for the primitive, we are of course interested whether this realization is actually faithful to its specification, so whether the implementation actually matches the specification. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning as well, on the implementation level, we're also interested in the side channel attacks, this physical observable behavior that is dependent on the execution environment. And importantly for implementations, this should all sort of hold for full optimization, because usually for a basic reference implementation, this is relatively, well, it's easier to show, of course, because the implementation logic is typically less complex. But eventually we want to deploy we want to guarantee the thing we deploy, so this should all go through after optimization as well. Right, and so now I want to sort of focus on one specific tool chain, yeah, which is the Easy in Jasmine, which is the tool chain that is used by Forza. And so EasyCrypt and Jasmine are tools that are sort of have an integration and bridges this gap that I talked about between implementation and specification. So EasyCrypt is a sort of proof system, or a building proof, but it essentially means that you can perform the mathematical reasoning by computers. And it's aimed at core proofs, while Jasmine is an implementation framework that is aimed at implementing optimized cryptography. And so the typical workflow here, when you have like a primitive scheme that you want to implement, is you would specify an EasyCrypt in a mathematical way, as you usually do on pen and paper as well. But then you use the tool to machine check your proofs. So the proofs that we usually have on pen and paper, we now do in the tool and then check the whole sort of reasoning, and so thereby we establish the correctness and security in the tool. And then on the other hand, we have the implementation in Jasmine, which we code as we do when we implement stuff. And the Jasmine framework actually provides certain automated tool checkers that for this source implementation prove the safety and the constant time behavior of the implementation. So safety here essentially boils down to the semantics being well defined, so there is no undefined behavior, so it behaves as expected essentially. And the constant time is exactly this specific side channel that I showed, like the examples of TPP failures with where there is observable timing differences based on secret values, which allows you to extract secrets, which this proves is not, which these tools then show is not sort of the case for this implementation. Then it depends on the timing more typically timing differences, or at least doesn't use these instructions, I should say. And so then we compile it down to assembly, as we also usually do when we have implemented something. But as opposed to typical compilers like a C compiler, this compiler has been also verified separately to actually maintain the things that you care about for cryptographic implementation, or at least some of these properties that are listed there. So in particular, the package and constant time. which, for example, for every other regular general purpose language is not the case. So, for example, C has the C compilers have typically no guarantees that they maintain any form of constant time property. Right, and then now, so the bridge, this is where the bridge community comes in. The Jasmine framework also provides a tool for extending a model of your implementation from Jasmine to EasyCap. And then at that point you have your implementation essentially in EasyCap, and you can again use the tool to formally prove, machine check the reasoning of your proof that the implementation actually matches the specification on which you did the security proof, and thereby sort of transfer the guarantees to the implementation. Right. So, and then for this specific toolchain, that has been pretty successful, I would say, in recent years. We have become pretty decent at doing stuff. So, a couple of examples here, which I won't go into detail, but essentially they all follow this workflow that I just said and just completed it in yes, for Kaido and Hocken, which is the recent standardized post-quantum camera. We have SHA-T as well, for example, the hash function that is also standardized and widely used, as well as XMSS, which is a post-quantum signature, also standardized. Yeah. So for all of these, actually, we have the whole sort of workflow that I just described, and including optimized implementations, except for XMSS, which doesn't have an optimized implementation, but it is being worked on. Yeah. But if you have an optimized implementation, I guess I should add this to the previous workflow. So you first typically do this for a reference implementation, and then afterwards you optimize your implementation and you make sure the proof still sort of goes through, you update your proof. Yeah. Right, so now a sort of typical question that comes up is, okay, that's very nice, this workflow, and nice to do stuff, but in practice, no one uses this specific sort of language or tools, and you might want to actually adopt these tools or commit to these tools if you're just like programming or having your software in C or Rust or whatever language you use. And so a sort of mid-way solution here is there's a library of sort of formalized and implemented primitives that have also, for which also this whole workflow has been sort of connected. Yes, so this essentially for multiple primitives, among which ones that I listed here before, as an example. And so then this library, this provides the whole development, but in particular the assembly. And so if you go then, if you use sort of the same platform or architecture, then you can sort of integrate it there, which is sort of like a middle solution to not adopting the whole toolchain. Right, so then finally, I've now discussed or shown you a specific sort of set of tools here, the most one, in EasyCap and Jasmine, and also the implementation. But the both ends of the both ends of the spectrum, yeah, on the primitive design and the implementation side, there's many other tools which we use for this purpose. So for this primitive, these are all tools that do similar things to EasyCap, that they allow you to specify your specification, your scheme, your primitive, and then formally prove security. And on the implementation side, there's also many tools, and some of them, well, mostly they stay within this implementation lane, some of them go, yeah, so some of them mostly stay in the implementation lane, some allow them to also prove functional patterns, but mostly implementation. But this bridge that is also like important, that I just started with and Jasmine, there's not many alternatives, so I put the question mark here. There's like some decent combinations of tools that should technically allow you to do this, but yeah, not many actual use cases that have been sort of probably formalized and implemented and bridged together. And so then for future work, we sort of tie it in more with the subject of this conference, is that we got quite decent at doing this stuff, mostly for the fundamental things still. So the confidentiality, authentication, some of the related properties and protocols, but the more advanced properties for specifically the anti-surveillance or privacy properties, we don't really have much work on that yet. And these also seem to be, well, I haven't looked into it in too much detail, but they seem to be a different kind of approach needed. And so from our experience, this requires, well, discussions and conversations and collaboration between the actual privacy surveillance property experts as well as tool experts to see how to best formalize and recognize these properties. So yeah, work there is still new. And yeah, I want to keep it at that.
Very good. So, yeah, any questions?
Thanks. Thank you. I have two questions. So one is, given a protocol, can these tools be used to also detect opportunities for optimization instead of you have a protocol and the sort of, I don't know, hash version or whatever, added to it, more and more complex it becomes and affect performance. Other do these tools have opportunities to detect redundant components?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So I personally, it is also a evidence for the difference in the only location. I'm not a protocol person necessarily, but so I think definitely you use them for detecting redundance or optimizations, and definitely in the fact that you can sort of model your optimizing and run the tool against the. So this is, I mean, this is a bit of cheating, yeah. But so I don't really know if you can. So this is mostly focused on security. Yeah, I'm not really sure if you can effectively use them in a lot of cases for automatically detecting optimizations. Probably then it sounds like it should be reasonably. But I think it needs to be doable, but in certain cases at least. But yeah, I'm not too sure if that's a systematic way that people do this. Yeah. So.
Yeah, just curious. I mean, you can't do research. It sounds like quite often. The second question I have is, so these tools, when you have to prove to show that it's secure, so you kind of rely on these tools to be correct and have no buttons on. It sounds like a perfect role, but it doesn't exist. I didn't know cases where people make some proofs that turn out to be inherently to like browse these tools.
So actually, so this is a very good point. So obviously this is a concern, yes. And the way people like to design these tools is that you have this sort of very small kernel that is trusted, on which the rest of the tool is built. And so you have a small block to verify. And if you use a tool, of course, like many developments, the trusted part remains the same, right? Because all the sort of amortized over the multi-proof, right? But to answer actually the question whether these bugs have been found and used for proving, I am not sure of any specific example where a human made a proof relying on a working tool and thereby was sort of accepted. But in recent times with AI protection, people have been using AI with these formal tools. Because I mean, it makes a lot of sense conceptually. Like you use AI to monitor because this is proving. So this is, you like usually how you do the tool before, and then the tool actually gets to the AI and produce solve. So this is like a very sort of nice direction, but then the AI actually tries to be smart, and like it's hard to actually prove it. Let's look at the structure of the thing and try to find out. So AI tries to sometimes be better and find bugs instead of actually doing the proof. And so there have been a couple of cases like this, but for human proof, you're actually just trying to follow the logic of the proof. I don't know any specific actual cases where the proof went through because of the bug. There had been bugs as well, but then they were fixed and the proof still went through.
What movement is like a specification, let's say, very appropriate and given specification which should be correct, but then the proof will actually incorrectly. So not like a wrongly specified proof, really the execution of that proof is going to be incorrect, and just invalidating the completeness. So I'm concerned about bugs and Cryptography or tamerins are not in the actual written or derived proof. So you're trusting the tool, like you're trusting tamerins to execute correctly. Let's say your proof is like 1 + 1 = 2, or 1 + 1 = 3, right? You write 1 + 2, the tool does something completely different.
Okay, but the statement is so correct. Let's see. What was the question? Is you write a correct statement and
or you write an incorrect statement, but the tool tells you correct. Sorry, 1 + 3.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, yeah. This is actually the thing that I was talking about. You have like a tool which obviously software and contain parts, but you try to sort of minimize the plus servers that you have to have a focused specific point of needing to verify, and then this is the only plus part. Yeah? So if you find out, you obviously need to fix that. But yeah, and so also not all this is also the most extreme case, and not that if you find like one bug, this sort of ruins the whole logic of the whole tool. Anything else to be typically bugs are just like very minor things that you need to abuse. If it's even like a logic bug, then you need to abuse to get to a point where you can use it to actually prove something that is incorrect. Right? So this is just sort of but there's always this first goal. Yes, you know what that.
Okay, great. We are quite kind of past schedule. So now we start our coffee break. First of all, for everyone who has a special diet order, you can find opposite the registration counter, the special diet food. And also, since we are a little bit late now, usually additional days, so we start at the end of the coffee break, a new session and the natural feast. So, have a nice coffee break.